Well, I'm not a constitutional scholar. There is likely a reason that the founding fathers of the United States put the First Amendment first. I mean, they could have put it in any order in terms of the other amendments. Coming first, of course, bestows it with some kind of special significance. In the pantheon of amendments, it is a pretty important one. Now, if you ask people what the First Amendment guarantees, odds are that they will tell you it gives us freedom of speech. I mean, that's assuming they know what it represents at all, which might be optimistic thinking. But the First Amendment is more than just freedom of speech. As we can see, the First Amendment also encompasses the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This means that we not only have the right to speak freely, but the right to do so in groups. There might be regulations associated with getting permits and other kinds of permissions, but beyond that, people have the right to get their voice and opinions heard. There have been a number of protests that have been cropping up in various parts of the United States in response to orders that non-essential businesses and other social spaces be closed. Governors have taken these steps to try to stem the spread of COVID-19, which has been overwhelming the healthcare system around the country, if not around the world. But these orders have not been even. As of April 2nd, we have these states in which stay-at-home orders have been issued. We can see that there is no uniform policy, and the federal government has only issued recommendations, but not orders regarding how states should act. So, as a result of that, states are left to their own devices to craft their responses as they see fit. For instance, here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, Charlie Baker, governor, who's also a Republican, issued this order back on March 10th. To provide for essential services to be continued while non-essential services to be closed. A crucial part of that order is the following, quote, whereas sections 7, 8, and 8A of chapter 639 of the Acts of 1950, I'm sure we all know what that means, authorize the governor during the effective period of a declared emergency to exercise any and all authority over persons and property necessary or expedient for meeting a state of emergency, including, but not limited to, authority over public assemblages in order to protect the health and safety of persons, regulating the sale of articles of food and household articles, and policing, protection, and preservation of public and private property, end quote. Essentially, this means that the governor has the authority at certain times to take extraordinary action to limit the ability to assemble in groups. Even though this right is supposedly guaranteed in the Constitution, all guarantees come with some amount of fine print. Part of that fine print goes into what is considered an essential service or business. On the one hand, it might seem obvious that certain businesses are vital, like hospitals and grocery stores and even liquor stores, but other choices of what's essential may not seem so obvious. For instance, there was this confusing bit of business from Governor Baker's order. First, gun shops and gun ranges were deemed essential. However, the governor quickly reversed course to close the same shops and ranges, deeming them suddenly non-essential. In fact, as the story indicates, the federal government has deemed gun shops essential. The actions of states to counter that recommendation has led to legal action to be taken to challenge these closings. It is pretty clear to see that being essential is in the eye of the beholder. It comes as no surprise that different parts of the country can be really different in terms of how they see the world. As a result, what is deemed essential can be pretty different as well. Case in point, we have this bit of news coming out of Florida, and remember, it's always Florida. It would seem that professional wrestling is in Florida an essential business. As the governor of Florida has noted, people are, quote, starved for new entertainment. I mean, you can only watch so many replays of professional teams from 10 years ago, and watching virtual NASCAR races, as I did this weekend, doesn't hold the attraction that one might think. Speaking in his new role as head of media production and programming, the governor said, quote, we haven't had a lot of new content since the beginning of March, end quote. So to help people deal with their entertainment appetite, he has sanctioned the World Wrestling, or WWE, used to be WWF, but then they got sued by an animal rights group. So he has sanctioned the WWE to record shows in front of empty arenas, broadcasting the shows to that starved public. To accomplish this move, quote, the state added a new category to its list of essential services. employees at professional sports and media production with a national audience, only if the location is closed to the general public. Speaking of appetites for entertainment, even the ancient Romans knew that you want to keep people appeased and generally chilled out. You have to give them bread and you have to give them circuses. Now, the idea of the bread and the circus was that people would be happy if their bellies were full and their attention was distracted by games. Quote, "The evil was not in bread and circuses per se, but in the willingness of the people to sell their rights as free men for full bellies and the excitement of the games, which would serve to distract them from the other human hungers which bread and circuses can never appease." And after a lot of weeks in lockdown, people are in need of some appeasement. Keep in mind that the quote unquote greatest generation went through a lot more than 1 month at home with Netflix, cable, and Wi-Fi, no matter how spotty. However, at the same time, even during the Great Depression, you could at least stand in a bread line without wearing a mask and worry about getting infected. The unique elements of this current moment makes any historical comparison rather difficult. And not having any historical comparison, it can be pretty difficult to know how people are going to react. Enter the state of Michigan, where a lot of people are reacting angrily about the stay-at-home order.
Brother, can I add one thing to that? Liberty must prevail.
We don't get to work, you don't get to work. Freedom is essential.
Our community is struggling. My husband is on unemployment for the first time in our life. And it's unwillingly that we're taking unemployment. We want to go back to work.
Time for our state to be opened up. We're tired of not being able to buy the things that we need, go to the hairdressers, get our hair done. It's time to open up.
Ready to stand defiant against this governor and open up business tomorrow. Lock her up! 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 Lock her up!
I know that people are angry, and that's okay. And if you want to take it out and send it my way, if it makes you feel better, that's fine. We know that this rally endangered people. When people gather that way without masks, they were in close proximity, they were touching one another, that's how COVID-19 spreads. And so the sad irony here is that the protest was that they don't like being in this stay-home order, and they may have just created a need to lengthen it, which is something that we're trying to avoid at all costs.
We can all agree the fact that this woman's roots are showing is a tragedy of monumental proportions that might itself require government intervention. I can't pretend to know the tragedy of having one's roots show and not being able to get a cut in color. While not guaranteed in the Constitution, I do think we can all imagine, given the fashion and fancy wigs of the constitutional time, that the founders would be sympathetic to this woman's plight. As to the motivation of the protests that occurred in the state capital of Lansing, the Michigan Republican Party issued the following tweets to defend the protest. To the issue of what is essential and non-essential, the tweets discuss whether a job can be done safely, should be considered in determining whether people can get back to work. They continue that a more local and regional approach should be taken, given that different parts of the state might be experiencing the pandemic at different rates, especially those parts that are more sparsely populated. And finally, quote, people are upset because they believe the restrictive order is taking away civil liberties and freedoms, end quote. There is the question of whether or not civil liberties and freedoms were taken away, or whether the governors were merely trying to implement policies for the greater good of the public. There are all kinds of laws and orders that exist to improve public safety. Civil liberties, as written in the Constitution, are not absolute and never have been. There is a lot of leeway provided for what might be considered the common good. Nevertheless, we have had some growing voices that have been calling for these measures to be relaxed under the auspices of violating civil liberties. Perhaps none so ironically as the president himself. He issued a number of tweets aimed at Minnesota, Virginia, and Michigan, calling for them to be liberated. It is important to note, of course, that states with Republican governors were not targeted by these tweets, even though they may have similar orders in place, like Massachusetts and like Ohio. Part of the irony lies in the states actually following directives given by the federal government, which the president is, you should know, in charge of. So that would mean part of his call for liberation would be from his own administrations and administration experts' recommendations. So I guess he's calling them to be liberated from the federal government, which I think a lot of people may agree with. And to say liberate would mean that they are in some respect not free or are enslaved. These orders in place are meant to take away freedoms, but to promote public safety during a global pandemic. We don't have the right to drive as fast as we want, wherever we want, whenever we want. There are laws to penalize us not wearing a seatbelt. There are zoning ordinances that dictate how homes can be built or how construction projects should take place. We have laws that say we have to have car insurance. Each of these laws are there to protect the broader public good. We don't see protests against seatbelts, for instance, as emblematic of the encroachment of the government on our individual liberties. Before you can bring a newborn home, for instance, from the hospital, you need to have an approved child safety car seat in your car and demonstrate that you do. And in fact, when my child was born, I asked the nurse on call, if I didn't have a car seat, would that mean the hospital has to keep my baby? She did not find that funny. Rather than this regulation being called out as government overreach, the baby seat video market is a new entertainment genre on YouTube, as you might imagine. And this is a point that is raised by the Attorney General of Michigan, who issued her own tweet saying that the protests themselves may in fact spread the virus even further, given that people were not wearing masks, were not maintaining social distance, and were potentially endangering themselves and others. Given the increased risk and danger that the protesters were creating, the Attorney General concluded that this, quote, does not make you a patriot, end quote. In fact, in looking at those at the protests, it is easy to get confused by the mixed messages on display. While you had those who were saying the whole thing in terms of the pandemic was an overblown media creation, you had some of those same people at the protests, in fact, wearing protective gear, such as this gentleman.
First of all, tell us your name and what brought you out here.
My name is Joseph Dixon, and I came out here to support the Michigan businesses and stand up for the rights of our fellow Michiganders. And we believe that the governor has overreached and overstepped her rights with our freedoms.
Are you concerned about this virus?
I was in the beginning until I've done my research and found out the realities and the media's overreach on it, and that it's not as serious as they made it out to be. And that's why I am here, because I feel that they are overreaching, overreacting, and crushing our small businesses, crushing our economy.
I see you're wearing a mask, so you appear to have some level of concern.
Yes, well, I have concern. I have just common courtesy for people. I might be here today, I might be a Republican, but I have common sense, and I do have concern and respect for everybody.
Now, I understand that this gentleman has, quote, done his research and found out the reality, end quote, that the, quote, media overreach, end quote, made it out to be more serious than it actually is. I am not sure what kind of research that entailed, and if, for instance, he has a degree in epidemiology and or medicine. And sure, he is wearing a mask with holes in it, which kind of runs against the whole protection element. But that is not because he has a concern for the pandemic, but rather out of common courtesy for others. He's just trying to be thoughtful. And I do understand he wants his economy to be rescued. And I do understand that he's worried about the economic ramifications of the shutdown. I also understand that the news reporter wearing his mask shows he also might be unclear on how personal protective equipment is supposed to work. and that should actually go over your nose and not just under it. And that together, these two might actually form the basis of a new buddy comedy movie where we watch them get into all kinds of hijinks, failing to maintain social distancing and personal safety in the time of a global pandemic. The questioning of whether the pandemic is something serious or even something real or something so scary that one has to buy all the yeast and flour in a grocery store, even though you've never baked bread before, has spawned a new term of covidiots. This term from the Urban Dictionary defines a covidiot as, quote, someone who ignores the warnings regarding public safety or health, as well as a person who hoards goods, denying them from their neighbors. As in, did you see that covidiot with 300 rolls of toilet paper in his basket? Or did you see that covidiot saying the pandemic is a hoax while wearing personal protective equipment incorrectly? It is understandable that those who fear the pandemic also fear the consequences of losing their jobs and their businesses and even their homes. And in fact, a lot of populist movements are born out of economic insecurity and anxiety. And with over 22 million recently unemployed, there is a lot of insecurity and anxiety. It can extend to those who deny that there is any danger whatsoever, calling the pandemic a hoax or no worse than the flu or the cold.
There's no pandemic. Media is the cancer.
People are going to die. They're dying no matter what.
I need a haircut.
So
yes. It's great.
For heaven's sake, open the barber shops. Open the hair salons. We need haircuts, okay? We gotta buy food. We gotta go to work. We gotta provide for our families. When it comes to the pandemic, are you scared at all? Do you believe in it?
Yes,
yes, I believe
we
it's
sure
real.
do. Exactly, it is real.
We still have a right, I think, to work.
And we have a higher power that we believe in that takes care of us. And I know that it's a real thing. The pandemic is a real thing. We do believe in that.
It's not
but
fake,
we want to work. We want to work. We don't want a government handout.
Almost none of the street protesters Thursday wore masks or physically distanced, as the CDC recommends.
No, we aren't. We're not scared of this virus.
God bless America.
Where's the circus? It's in that building right now where they're pretending that we need a social distance. Where they're pretending we need masks. They should wear the mask.
We are innocent until proven guilty, which means we do not need an immunity certificate. We do not need a test to prove that we're not vectors of disease and out walking around.
We want them opened up so we can make our own health. You don't need to be our deciding factor when we go to the doctor. We can't get to the doctor right now because you got it all clouded up with corona. It's not all about corona, it's about cancer. It's about all these other diseases and all these other illnesses. People being put on hold for surgeries and stuff because you need to open it back up and let us be our own choice, our own voice.
Can I see the back of your vest? So this is Bikers for 45. He's the president of the Minnesota chapter.
If you can't make the choices for yourself, you no longer live in a free country. And right now, we do not live in a free country. We have to wait for permission from the government at many levels to be able to do something. Go out of the house, go shopping, gather in groups of 10 or more.
Men and women are tyrants! My husband and my son were confronted by the police last week for simply trying to make a living, all the while these politicians are being paid from our tax dollars! They are suffering! They are suffering! We are suffering! This is an uprising!
We have real-world examples. We had a church gathering here in Kansas that had 50 people infected, 6 deaths, and they went to 9 counties so far, and with the illness, and have that's how the spread occurred.
Have you considered the health ramifications of being in a large group of people?
Yes.
And that doesn't change your mind?
No.
Why do you think the doctors are saying that?
They don't have any choice. Of course they have to say that.
USA! USA! USA!
Now in this video, there are a lot of different messages happening. We have those who are willing to die no matter what. While they are scared of the virus, they are also concerned about making a living and providing for their families. You have those who really just want a haircut and want to go to the salon and are irate about that fact. An overarching theme is that people need to make their own choices and have freedom to decide how to live their lives. And in fact, while chanting USA, 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 it is the case that the USA is the leader by far in the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And much of this sentiment is being expressed in the protest that we see happening around the country beyond Michigan. For example, we have in Ohio, GOP lawmakers and protesters calling on Republican Governor Mike DeWine to, quote, reopen, unquote, Ohio. We see here a picture of protesters voicing their displeasure with the stay-at-home order and perhaps not being able to get haircuts. Then we have this lawmaker from Ohio, Republican Representative Heather Scott, who is making the claim that the stay-at-home orders are, quote, no different than sending Jews to extermination camps. She also compared the Republican Governor Brad Little to Adolf Hitler. We also have Pennsylvania, where Democratic Governor Tom Wolf is being challenged by the Republican Senate, who approved a bill that would allow county governments to implement their own plans to reopen independent of the state's plan. We even have the Department of Justice being pressured by a variety of Republican voices and groups to challenge the legal foundation of these stay-at-home orders and whether or not they curtail liberties and freedoms. They say these orders are, quote, rampant abuses of constitutional rights and civil liberties, end quote. Whether or not these orders are constitutional or not is an open question, or perhaps not an open question at all, depending on who you ask. For instance, here we have New York Governor Andrew Cuomo commenting on who has the authority to reopen the states and what role does the federal government play in that decision, if they play any role at all.
And the only thing he's doing, let's be honest, well, it's up to the states to do reopen. By the way, it was always up to the states. What are you going to grant me what the Constitution gave me before you were born? It's called the 10th Amendment. I didn't need the President of the United States to tell me that I'm governor. And I didn't need the President of the United States to tell me the powers of a state. People did that. Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they are the ones who gave me the power. And I don't need the President of the United States to read the Constitution for me. Maybe he should have read the Constitution before he said he had the power to open the states.
In his answer, the governor cites the Founding Fathers, the same Founding Fathers that wrote the First Amendment, as giving him the right to administer his state as he sees fit in the time, especially in the time of a crisis. The 10th Amendment quotes, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people," end quote. This 10th Amendment serves as a foundation of federalism or states' rights. There is a lot to this concept that goes beyond the scope of this video. But the simple thing to consider is how the states have rights to take action in the absence of federal government intervention or federal government power even. The federal government did not close businesses in states. That was the governors. And therefore, according to Andrew Cuomo and many other governors, do not have the legal right to reopen them. It's beyond their jurisdiction since they did no action at all to make it happen. And despite the presence of protesters at these various state capitals, in fact, far more persons are in favor of the stay-at-home order. We have this poll result from April 22nd, which said 87% of Americans support existing restrictions or even wishing for stricter ones. 87% agreeing with these restrictions would make this protester in the picture in Ohio very lonely indeed, as there wouldn't be a whole lot of people who agree with going to protest with them. We also see this bar chart, which conveys the sentiment is not evenly shared among political affiliations. In this chart, we see that Democrats believe the United States will move too quickly in lifting the restrictions, while Republicans worry that government will move too slowly. But overall, Americans are worried about restrictions being lifted too early, and as a result of that, the pandemic coming back too quickly. Another data point is provided by Leah McElrath, who tweeted that, quote, Texas is a huge state with 29 million people. She continues that, quote, about 100 astroturfed people are in Austin protesting closures. Now, if you do the math, about 100 into 29 million, you can see it's not a high percentage. She concludes that the vast majority of people have been observing these restrictions and cooperating with the stay-at-home orders. The concept of being astroturf refers to protests appearing to be grassroots and populist in nature, and reflecting a spontaneous intent of those protesting. However, the protests are being funded by wealthy backers who are coordinating these activities, making it not populist at all. And in fact, there is ample evidence that these protests started not with populist movements or spontaneous sentiment, but those with money who are looking for people to get back to work and get back to buying goods despite the risks stated by medical professionals. We even have some counter-protests popping up, like this person on Twitter and her Liberate America of Trump dance. I'm not sure how effective this kind of protest is when done by yourself in an alley. Kind of misses the whole point of a flash mob, but you have to give her this. At least she's observing social distancing and following the orders against gathering in large numbers. So social media will have to suffice, I suppose, to generate her Liberate Trump dance movement. Perhaps more dramatic is this moment that occurred in Denver, where protesters were driving around the Capitol, which included a hospital, or around the hospital in the state capitol. Workers from the hospital came out to confront those cars, setting up this image. Produced this dramatic photo of the hospital worker blocking a Ram 1500, which is probably not a great advertisement for Dodge or Ram, juxtaposing those who are putting their lives on the line for those who would like to see people risk their lives to reopen the country. Again, we see the point raised of whether their freedoms are in fact being taken away and whether or not such action taken by governors is constitutional or communist. It is pretty remarkable to see this woman yell at the worker to go to China, even though he is putting his own life on the line to save the lives of those infected by COVID-19, even if they got it, protesting around a state capitol without wearing masks. And we are a long way from reopening the country if we are relying on testing to make that happen in a safe manner. We see in this New York Times chart from April 17th, the amount of testing we would need to reopen the country by May 15th. Compared to our level of current testing. On April 15th, we were at 45 tests being done per 100,000 people. We would need to get to 152 tests per 100,000 people in order to reopen the country safely. This means the number of daily tests would need to be between 500,000 to 700,000 tests. This shortfall in testing is not deterring everyone, however. A number of voices aligned with conservative or Republican circles have been circulating the point that we can't let the cure be worse than the disease, and that while we might stop the spread of COVID-19, the economic damage will result in other worse outcomes, like a destroyed economy, higher suicide rates, more crime, and other ills associated with an economic depression. And those concerns are in fact real. Economic depressions can produce a wide range of social ills and social problems beyond just the factors that cause that economic downturn. Here we have Dr. Oz on Sean Hannity talking about the impact of keeping schools closed, for instance.
Dr. Oz, help us. Well, first, we need our mojo back. Let's start with things that are really critical to the nation where we think we might be able to open without getting into a lot of trouble. I tell you, schools are a very appetizing opportunity. I just saw a nice piece in The Lancet arguing that the opening of schools may only cost us 2 to 3% in terms of total mortality. And, you know, that's any life is a life lost. But to get every child back into a school where they're safely being educated, being fed, and making the most out of their lives with a theoretical risk on the backside, it might be a trade-off some folks would consider. We need to get industry back, supply lines. I mean, things that we can do without putting the nation at risk.
It is not clear what his 2 to 3% mortality number came from. But if we walk out that 2% of the total population, it looks like between 7 million and 10 million people dead. That would be 2 to 3% of the total population of 350 million. If, big if, we just took those 50 years old and older, those being the most at risk of COVID-19, this mortality number would be between 2 million and 3 million. While, as Dr. Oz says, that every life is precious, losing over 2 million due to opening schools too soon would be downright horrifying. And that's not just them dying, but the impact that would have on the healthcare system overall, unless you just shut down the hospitals and let them die at home on their own, which I haven't seen floated as an option yet, but I would imagine it's coming soon. Another element of the First Amendment being impacted by this stay-at-home moment is the closing of religious institutions in some part of the country. It is not an order against places of worship per se, but rather a limit on how many people can gather in one location. Here's a map that lays out how different states are proceeding in relation to religious organizations. Some states have outright religious exemptions, meaning that there are no limits to how many people can gather at a place of worship. It's deemed essential. Other states have at least some prohibitions, with others being unclear. As the map showed, Kansas is one location in dispute. There, a federal judge blocked limits on religious gatherings. Quote, the ruling from U.S. District Judge John Brooms prevents the enforcement of an order by Governor Laura Kelly if pastor and congregations observe social distancing, end quote. The governor defended her order by stating, this is not about religion. This is about a public health crisis. And therein lies the issue. We have a public health crisis of monumental proportions on our hands. Governors are taking steps to try to limit that crisis by instituting new orders that impact what our way of life used to be like before the pandemic. Failing to observe these orders will result in a much higher loss of life, more negative impact on our healthcare system, and prolong the economic impact of the virus on the country. At the same time, you have those who either are not worried about the pandemic or are willing to take the risk of being out in public, like this person at a state capitol protest. It may be certainly laudable that this person has a vaccine in the form of Jesus, and this person is more than welcome to practice that vaccine and rely on it for his own personal protection. However, your ability to practice your own religion does have its limits when that practice can cause greater harm to a larger number of people. If your religion involves human sacrifice, there is a greater public interest at limiting that activity by outlawing it. The First Amendment does not hold here in terms of your freedom of religion and to commit human sacrifice in any number, regardless how precious life is. One pastor says that death is a welcome friend and that Christians should defy the lockdown even if it kills them. They are not only risking themselves in the process. Quote, the Bible teaches us to be absent from our bodies so we can be present with the Lord. So like any revolutionary or like any zealot or like any pure religious person, death looks like to them a welcome friend, end quote. Now, Pastor Spell is more than welcome to make a friend of death if he likes. However, when his choice of friends causes a broader public health crisis, then it can and has been argued that there is a greater public interest at hand. And then the government has the right to step in and limit his friendship with death to some extent. But this view is clearly not shared, not even by those in government. Here is Republican Representative from Ohio, Jim Jordan, calling for an investigation on those who have placed limitations on religious gatherings and called these actions a threat to liberty.
And one of the things we should do, Judge, particularly on the Judiciary Committee, we should be looking at the very thing you talked about in your opening monologue. We should be looking at the threats to liberty we see where governors are saying you're going to get a ticket if you go to church, where the mayor of Los Angeles, one of our biggest cities, the mayor of Los Angeles said snitches will be rewarded. What kind of message is that? We had a
in between the government completely dictating what you can and cannot do at any time, and allowing people to do whatever they want at any time, regardless of broader consequences, lies the balance we are trying to strike. There is a saying in the law that your liberty to swing your fist ends just where my nose begins. This simply means that if you take an action that directly harms me, then I have a say in whether or not you can do it. You might not like me and want to set my house on fire, but that's going to cause harm to me, and therefore there are laws against you setting my house on fire. It also means that there should be a pretty clear line that connects your action to my harm. If you're smoking a cigarette and you toss a cigarette out a car window and that cigarette sets my house on fire, you might be guilty of littering, but unless we can show that you intentionally did that to set my house on fire, that's about it. The more tenuous that link, the less say I will have on whether or not you can commit that action. So the penalty there is against littering, who likes to see a bunch of cigarette butts on the road, not against you burning down my house. So what do you think about these issues? To what extent should the state or federal government be able to dictate your freedoms and liberties in a time of national crisis? Do our civil liberties mean that we never have to limit our behaviors and that we can do whatever we want, whenever we want? What rights do states have versus a federal government in determining what can happen in their state boundaries? And what is the risk of losing those kinds of rights permanently once they've been taken away? Are they going to be more difficult to get back? Once we lose the right to assemble because of the pandemic, does that mean we're not going to have the right to assemble once the pandemic is over? So use the QR code provided here. Let me know what you think, and let me know what you think the state should do or the federal government should do regarding people in gatherings.